They came back with stars on their skin and the wrong names pressed to my lips. I remember the moment before the world tipped. I had been washing a jar on the back step while twilight bled into the maple trees. The twins' laughter a distant chime as they chased a firefly across the lawn. Then silence, sharp as a snapped wire, so sudden I thought one of them must have tripped. I called for them the way I had every night since they were born. "Alina, come in, it's getting cold." The answer that returned was not a voice. It was absence, and then the search, and then the headlights, and then men in vests with polite mouths who suggested a misremembered step, a ditch, a neighbor's late-night lawnmower. I believed them until the television cameras arrived, and the city's sympathy braided into my hair like a crown of thorns. A week later, 2 children in my doorway reached for me and said, in a sound like rain on metal, "Mother," and their skin shimmered as if constellations were dissolving beneath the surface. One pressed a small damp hand to my cheek and smiled with a kindness that was heartbreakingly wrong. I held them because there was no other thing to hold. I kept them because my arms remembered exactly how twins fit into a single embrace. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The agency called themselves Diplomacy, letters stamped in a font chosen to look gentle. Their vans were white as hospital light. Their spokespeople had voices so smooth they could varnish a lie. Agent Daniel Harlow walked up my porch with a folder under his arm and a face that seemed designed to inspire both trust and caution. The kind of face that had kept secrets for a living, and, in the curve of his mouth, a memory of private things he refused to gamble away. He addressed me as Miss Voss, even though I had been called Mama for 12 years and Elena for the rest, and he introduced 2 small companions as wards, placed into temporary human care for their protection. There were forms to sign and cameras to be placarded, and a press line rehearsed to a hum. The cameras hummed at the property line like a swarm of indifferent bees, and the city chewed the story into headlines that smelled of pity and fear. My own face was on the screen, raw as a wound. People said, with the easy certainty of those who watch from safe distances, that the swap was an act of mercy. They said there had been reciprocal placement, protocols enacted quietly between governments and whatever emissary had first hung over metropolis and sky. Diplomacy's documents used words like minors, custodial transfer, and reciprocal humanitarian exchange.
In the dossier Daniel left me, secured in a folder stamped with a seal that made my stomach drop, there were legal clauses designed to cushion responsibility. We assume guardianship, we comply with interspecies accords, we seek to minimize harm. There was a badge, too, plastic and official, granting access to a restricted wing of the Ministry of Extraterrestrial Affairs I had never known existed. I kept the badge in my palm until the plastic warmed to my skin, and then I slid it into the drawer where my twins' favorite toy trucks used to sleep. Lyra did not speak my language at first. Her mouth formed the sound of my name like someone handling a delicate instrument for the first time. Elena, rain metal syllables that made the whole room tilt. She was older than the other child, a cautious smallness that watched the world from under lashes that looked like they belonged to sea creatures. Her skin held a pattern. In the right light, it was like a night sky that had been splashed onto flesh, a geometry of tiny motes that pulsed faintly when she laughed. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, those motes would dim and then flare again, and I would hold her as if I could breathe the light back into her. The other child, small with an insurgent curl that defied the gravity of everything, reached for my hair and called me Mother in that metallic rain lilt, trusting as if he had known me always. I am an astrobiologist. My life had been built on telescopes and patience and the soft liturgy of hypothesis. I measured life in cultures and sample sizes, in the meticulous care of experiments that obeyed laws even when human hearts did not. This was my grounding. Evidence, repeatability, the comforting revolution of facts. Motherhood had been an experiment of a different sort. Chaotic, unruly, an organism that refused my careful hands and taught me instead to surrender. So when the agency said their decision had been to preserve peace, to prevent an interspecies breakdown that could unravel treaties and lives, words meant to soothe the country rinsed like acid against the unscientific parts of me. My loyalty was to truth. My body belonged to my children. The 2 who were stolen and the 2 who came back were not aligned on any axis I understood. The week after the swap, the television talked like a chorus of priests. Experts opined about first contact tiredness, about a species that could nurture and replace, about the ethical tightrope the state had to walk. Online, threads twisted into two camps, those who called me a hero for accepting my new wards, and those who accused me of being complicit in some quiet, state-sanctioned theft. The agency offered counseling, media training, and occasional reassurances that the twins were safe and that I was performing the noble role of a foster parent for beings who needed to learn to be human. They called it placement. I called it theft in the way you call a hot iron a weapon.
Daniel's visits oscillated between clinical updates and conversations that smuggled tenderness under the guise of protocol. At times, when he thought cameras and microphones were elsewhere, his voice would lower, and he would say my name, Elena, with the softness of someone who had memorized another person's scars. "Why us?" I asked him once, in the sterile glow of a government office where plants wilted under the hum of fluorescent lights. "Why my house? Why the twins?" The words tasted like metal. He folded his hands and looked at the window, as if whatever passed beyond the glass had answers he could not share. "Because you notice," he said finally. "Because you're an astrobiologist who has a record of humane handling, and because you live where the exchange would be least noticeable, and because, in their estimation, you would be more likely to care than to report." Care. The verb fell between us like a coin I was not allowed to flip. His admission was an apology and a barb. I thought of the backyard where the twins had vanished, the dewy grass, the place where the fence bowed with the weight of an old neighbor's leaning photograph. I thought of the sound of their small feet on the kitchen tile, their mouths full of marshmallows, of the twins' secret language that had once fit our three bodies into a private orbit. Whatever logic the state had applied, it had not considered the geometry of a mother's heart. At night, when the city lights dimmed to a softened bruise, Lyra would sit on the windowsill and watch the sky as if reading notes only she could see. Sometimes she hummed a tune that made the windows fog in the shapes of unknown constellations. Once, she reached out a hand and drew a line in the condensation, a jagged arc that matched a formation on an atlas I kept dog-eared on my bookshelf. She pressed her forehead to mine and said something that felt like grief wrapped in curiosity. Then she found the word sorry in my voice and repeated it as if tasting its forgiveness. That simple mimicry folded me. Here was a creature learning to grieve in a language not quite human, and in learning, teaching me to grieve for what was gone. Despite the public narrative, evidence in my hands was a thin, shifting thing. Diplomacy allowed tests only in their labs. They allowed me to photograph the skin patterns, but forbade independent genetic analysis. I read the dossiers that outlined psychological acclimation programs and intercultural child-rearing, and the words scraped the inside of my skull like powder. There were mentions of a reciprocal placement clause, and arrangements struck in the gray hours of last winter's summit. There were references to an orbital custody facility, a place whose coordinates were blank where a name should be. The file that made my stomach drop was one labeled Transcendence, redacted in the middle with black stripes that stabbed the paper. Whoever had authorized the swamp had the power to blank out sentences and the moral vocabulary to do it without flinching. On the 7th night after the return, the twins' empty beds stared at me like accusation. I laid Lyra's hand in the hollow between the pillows where my children's faces used to be, and asked the question that had been heating itself in my chest. Are they alive? Lyra's fingers tightened, and she answered with an image rather than a word. A small, bright ship like a seed pod, the twins' faces reflected in its glass, and then a station that looked like a ring of glass and metal, hanging in a cold, indifferent sky. She spoke the shapes slowly, as if letting me learn one syllable at a time. The name she gave for the place was something that made my tongue trip. It was not English, but the cadence suggested a word we humans used with reverence: orbit. Daniel's next visit came with a new kind of softness, the sort reserved for a wound someone else was allowed to probe. "There are protocols," he said, and then quieter. "And there are politics." His eyes met mine and held mine as if seeking permission or rescue. "If what you suspect is true," he whispered, "it will collapse negotiations. It will be a war for narrative. They would call it aggression. They would say we violated reciprocal trust. So we raise children of another species in our homes and call it diplomacy?" I snapped. The sentence surprised me with its ferocity. Lyra flinched at the shape of my anger. The other child, who I still caught myself calling by my twins' names, reached for a biscuit and offered it to a bird that wasn't there. Daniel exhaled. "We placed them to avoid a larger fracture," he said. Some believed that the only way to prevent retaliatory removal of human minors was to ensure their young had human bonds. It's ugly, Elena. It's ugly and soft at the same time. That ugly softness wrapped itself around my throat. I had been chosen for my capacity to care. I had been delegated the role of guardian to beings I did not recognize and given access to truth only through the aperture of others' discretion. The dilemma blossomed bright and terrible: pursue the truth and risk tearing open an interspecies treaty that might cost lives, accept the official line and spend my life in the arms of two beings who were not mine, while my biological children spun in a place I could not reach. In the middle of the night, the two alien children slept curled against each other like leaves folded in prayer, and I watched them and felt my identity fracture into separate selves: biologist, mother, citizen, traitor. Outside, a press van idled, its door a dark mouth ready to consume any misstep. Inside, a badge lay in the drawer, and in it the tacit promise that the more I learned, the more I would be expected to conceal.
In my hand, I carried the ghost of a sound, the twins' last laugh, the metallic syllable of mother from lips that were not my own, and the soft, dangerous knowledge Lyra had given me of an orbital cradle that hummed with my children's presence. The dilemma closed like a fist. I had to decide whether to obey a diplomacy that had placed strangers in my arms for the sake of a fragile peace, or to tear the pact apart and risk becoming the person news anchors would call a trigger for the collapse of everything delicate and new in the cosmos between species. The first time I tried to pry at the edges of diplomacy's story, it felt like fishing with my bare hands in a river that had been dammed for 100 years. Everything I touched was slick and shifting, and the current beneath held teeth. I started small: anomalies in the files, a timestamp that looped back on itself, an access log that listed a name only as Spectre. Each discovery was an ember that warmed me and threatened to burn the house down. When I asked for independent testing, just a small panel, a swab to confirm what my eyes could not accept, they replied with an officiousness that smelled of both lotion and lie. "Custodial consent," they said. "Interference could harm acclimation." The words were wrappers around a vacuum. I found out how brave people keep their courage: in secret meetings at odd hours, in the tightness of their shoulders, in gifts of information like contraband bread. My first contact came through a woman named Priya, who worked in the ministry's archives, her sweater sleeves frayed from worry. She met me at a 24-hour diner whose coffee machine kept overcompensating with steam. Her hands trembled as she fed me photocopies, and in the low hum of the late-night crowd, there was the pure sound of someone trying not to be hunted. "They called it a safeguard," Priya said, sliding a thin packet across the syrup-slick table. When tensions rose during the summit, certain envoys demanded human placements as proof of good faith. They argued the emotional bonds would prevent hostilities. The paperwork, well, it's a clean fiction for messy politics. But Elena, she looked up with eyes that had been wrung dry by what she had seen. "There are transfer logs. They were done quietly. There's a mention of a ring station. There are photos, if you know how to read them." I pressed the images into my palms like contraband light. The photographs were clinical: gray-blue composites showing a ring station in orbit, small silhouettes against a scattering of stars, the faces of children reflected in its curved glass. A stamp on one corner read "Property, Transit Orbital, Restricted." The existence of a place with that name, an orbital cradle, had been hinted at in Lyra's fumbling stooges. Now the word itself, printed and authorized, felt like a blade. Priya's breath hitched. "They said the current placements are temporary," she whispered, "but temporary becomes standard if no one asks questions." When she left, she hugged me like a contraband and then disappeared under the fluorescent halo of a night bus. I folded the clipping into the pocket of my jacket and walked home as if I were carrying a bomb. The children met me at the door, small hands reaching, and I wanted desperately to erase the knowledge pressed against the skin of my ribs. But facts, unlike wishes,
do not dissolve when you wish them away. Daniel watched me change in increments. He tested how much to tell me by measuring the distance my face kept from his when we stood close enough for the air to remember his shape. Sometimes he revealed a hinge, some mechanism of the larger machine, an administrative infraction here, an ethics review delayed there. Each confession was an offering wrapped in the armor of his duty. Other times he returned to the script. We do not comment. We were under orders. We acted to preserve life. His voice carried the gravity of someone who had chosen an institution over a family before he met me, and the remnants of that choice lived in the way he braced his shoulders as if they had room for other weights. One night, when Lyra slept with a small constellation pressed to her throat, I caught Daniel in the kitchen. The light was too yellow for the time, trash night yellow, and the kettle on the stove whistled with the urgency of secrets refusing to be silent. "You're looking," he said flatly, handing me a mug. "At what?" I asked. "At fissures in something you've been told to accept." He hesitated, a wound that had not yet learned to scab. "There are people at the ministry who believe this was the only path. There are others who think the placement was an abomination of policy. And then there are those who—" He stopped, searching for the gentlest description, and his mouth turned to stone, took advantage. The kettle's whistle betrayed us with a shriek. I remembered the twin beds upstairs, the soft indentation where their heads had been. "Who?" I asked through the steam. "The ones who think a bargaining chip can be human," Daniel said, and the words were as precise and cold as a surgeon's cut. "They've been inserting children into alternate custody for longer than the public knows. It started as emergency diplomacy. Now it looks like precedent." I thought of Lyra's skin pulsing in the dark, and the other child's small hands, always busy with another secret. My heart felt like a coastal cliff. The erosion of it had been slow and also sudden. "If there are people who think of humans as chips," I said, "how do we stop them?" He put his hand over mine, heavy with the warmth of someone who had lent to comfort from a distance. "By not doing what they'd expect," he said, "by creating a new narrative."
In the days that followed, my life became a series of improvised betrayals, lying to journalists who asked for an exclusive, smiling for cameras that wanted grief with a single focus, failing to mention that Lyra hummed the same tune she had when she mimed orbiting a ring station. The children's acclamation sessions were staged performances where other agents taught them to smile on cue and to call me mother in a way public would understand, in English rounded and soft enough to dull alien edges. Lyra caught on to the cadence quickly. She clasped my fingers in the morning and practiced words like prayers. "Family," she said once, and her voice folded into mine. My heart answered before my mind. The public pressure became a weather system. Protesters gathered at the property line like migrating birds. Some brought signs that said, "We are all children," and had no idea how odd that slogan sounded against the machinery of diplomats. Others carried placards accusing me of being a traitor or a fraud. The children stared at the crowds from behind curtains and asked questions I couldn't fully answer. Sometimes Lyra would repeat a phrase she had heard from the angry fringe, "Return the stolen," and her face would crumple in a sorrow that had no owner. The more I loved these small, alien beings pressed into the shape of my life, the more public fury felt like a threat to everything I had left, to the chance to keep learning who they were, to the hope my real children were alive somewhere beneath an indifferent sky. I toyed with the idea of fleeing. There's a peculiar intimacy to the way a mother imagines escape. You rehearse it in the hollow of night, packing sandwiches, imagining loose shoes and the slap of small feet. But the universe we were all occupying, state, alien, and my own claustrophobic domesticity, was a net. Wherever I might run, their decisions would follow. Diplomatic enforcement could make my life a stage on the edge of a cliff with their agents the wind. Daniel's loyalties began to show hairline fractures. Once in the middle of the night, when the house had become a cathedral of small breaths, he told me a piece of his life he had not given to any file. He'd been a field operative before he was recruited into the ministry's inner circle, he said. He had seen what a world could do when it could not trust itself. "I believed in containment," he told me, "in preventing panic. But containment becomes control, and control hides 1,000 sins." "Are you telling me you regret it?" I asked, because the question was easier than the one that really lived inside me. Could I, a civilian with an aching need, trust the man whose whole life was the stewardship of secrets? He did not answer for a long time. There was a map of the city in his expression, points he visited, decisions he had made. "I regret how we used people to make peaceable optics," he said finally. "I regret what that cost someone else."
He looked into my face with a vulnerability that made me think of a cracked lens trying to make new sense of light. If we are to do something different, it has to be quietly. It has to be surgically honest. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe him as I wanted to believe that the twins' small faces would shine from the glass of an orbital station and that I could pluck them from whatever cradle held them. But in the small hours, the house was full of a different truth. Lyra's small hand searching my face as if cataloging the topography of grief. The other child's mutterings as he repeated a word that might have been a name or a number or a plea. The alien children were learning to be human in the shadow of a political event that had reshaped our private world. The first concrete path toward those orbital coordinates came through a man named Calder, an engineer who had worked on civilian orbital habitats and who had folded the station's logistical knowledge into a conversation he expected would shave years off his career, but instead carved a new scar into his conscience. He met me at a scrapyard where old satellites sat like sun-bleached whalebones. He had a sleeve of tattooed circuitry and a look that suggested he'd built toys for children who had no one to watch over them. "They moved kids through transit orbital for at least a cycle," he said, touching a corroded bolt as if it were a Rosetta Stone. "There are manifests, but they're compartmentalized. The ring is nominally a transfer hub. Things go in, things come out. But when the sums are done, some of the in-out ratios don't add up. That's how you know someone is lying. The math disagrees with them." "Can you get me on a manifest?" I asked, because the audacity of the request felt like an antidote to helplessness. He thought about the risk like someone thinking of a plunge into icy water. "I can give you a name," he said, "a logistics window, a shift change, but you'll need clearance, and penetration into the station's custody files will not be pretty." It was all scaffolding toward a ladder I could not yet climb. Each person who gave me a shard of truth offered it with a hand that shook. Each admission carried the odor of risk, black marks on careers, reputations stripped, families exposed to ruin. The agencies would not be amused by the curiosity of one mother. There would be consequences, public and private, that could break us all in ways that had less to do with politics and more to do with the raw geometry of loss. I began to plan in the only way a scientist knows how to plan when experiments have human stakes, with a method that respected both the data and the breadth of those involved. I kept a journal, each page a ledger of who had said what and when. I cataloged Lyra's patterns, how the motes under her skin pulsed in time with certain frequencies of sound, how the other child's dreams seemed to be auditory maps of places he had not yet been to with his body.
I taught them games in the way I used to coax a petri dish into life. Small, controlled stimuli with an eye for outcome. In the margins of my notes, I scrolled alternative futures, what it would mean if the twins were returned to me, what it would mean if I exposed the ministry and set off an interspecies uproar. The emotional push and pull of it was relentless. I loved these children. There was no thread of rationality that could unpick that fact, and yet every act of love felt like a betrayal of the ghosts who might still bear my son's laughter. When Lyra pressed her forehead to mine and asked, in a tentative repetition of a word for orbit, whether the sky was lonely, I wanted to scoop her up and give her a story that would not involve stations and secrecy. Instead, I taught her the names of constellations and lied about how fixed they were, making myths of stars as if story could replace truth. The house itself turned into a witness. The twins' old toys gathered dust in a corner like fossils. Lyra would sometimes pick up a plastic truck and roll it slowly across the floor, watching its motion with the solemnity of someone learning cause and effect. She learned to laugh at our private jokes and to fold her fingers like I did when I prayed. The other child, whose smallness reminded me daily of what I had lost, began to hum the same tune as Lyra and pressed his head into my chest as if memorizing the map of my heart. Their faith in me was a kind of currency that made every decision sting with new commerce. And Daniel, whose allegiance was a gradient rather than a line, began to bend toward what I asked of him: small allowances, access to records under the pretense of acclamation oversight, the softening of interviews. Each concession he gave felt like a smaller revolution. But with each small victory came a recoil from the state, increased surveillance on the property, a new agent who watched the comings and goings with a face like a shield, an order from higher to tighten the narrative. It was as if the institutions that had sacrificed humanity for optics were now circling to ensure their wound never bled. The push and the pull were not mere plot mechanics. They became the weather of my days. Hope buoyed me. The manifests Calder offered, the whispered names in Priya's files, Lyra's accidental sketches of ringed stations. Fear pulled me under, the state's power, the possible death of cooperation that kept cities and planets from becoming battlefields, the possibility that my sons were being held in a place where retrieval meant something larger than a local fight. The children, for their part, were becoming flatter and deeper than any dossier could capture. They loved in the blunt, uncompromising ways of beings who had been displaced, with a hunger that was both tender and vast.
One evening, as rain stitched the yard into silver and the babies slept, Daniel brought something I had been denied since that first folder, an unsecured printout with a single unredacted line, a transit window for a class of cargo labeled Children, Custodial Rotation 7. The coordinates were a phrase, not a number, an access code that smelled of bureaucracy and of carelessness. His hands shook as he set the paper on my kitchen table. "This is enough to get you one step further," he said. "It's not the whole story, but it's an opening." The opening felt like air after drowning. My chest made the unfamiliar, painful sound of inhaling into a new shape. Yet even the hope tasted of ash, because the path forward required that I choose a kind of treason, to use privilege and guile and whatever mercy remained in Daniel's conscience to pry open a station that had been sealed in a bargain made by people with colder hearts than mine. It required that I decide which children to hold first, the ones in my bed and the ones reflected in Lyra's half-formed maps, and whether the line I might cross would save my family or ruin lives I could not fully know. The dilemma sharpened as the rain beat on the roof, to act and risk collapse, or to guard the fragile peace and live with the double life of loving the wrong children while my real children orbited in someone else's custody. My notebooks filled with plans and prayers, my hands did the math of possibility. I slept in the small hours of midnight and woke to the soft weight of alien breaths in my house. The pull of rescue tightened, the push of consequence recoiled. The world held its breath, and I, who had always been a scientist, realized that some experiments do not end with data and charts, but with the breaking of whatever is most human inside you. Maternal devotion, the ethics of policy, the definition of what family could possibly be when the sky itself began to exchange its young. In that liminal place, between the possibility of retrieval and the risk of collapse, I learned the dangerous courage of mothers who have nothing left but the faith that love, if loud enough and stubborn enough, can demand a new kind of diplomacy, one that names children as more than tokens. I also learned the other kind of courage, the one that asks whether to save one life if it means the sacrifice of other lives you cannot see. The answer would not be given in a single night. It would be earned, with noise and with quiet, with betrayal and with tenderness, and with Daniel at times pointing the way, and at other times stepping between me and the consequences of my choices. The next step, I decided as the rain slowed into a hush, would be to use Daniel's opening. I would press into the station's manifest, follow Calder's logistical windows, and pry at the one hinge that might swing wide enough to let me reach the twins. If the door opened, we would have to move faster than the ministry could redraft a narrative. If it did not, then the consequences would be larger than my grief. Either way, the shape of what I loved, two small alien children with constellations on their skin, and two small human ones who might be held inside a ring of glass, would force me to choose how I loved. As someone who saves the people at hand, or someone who exposes an injustice at potentially existential cost. I went to bed with a list of names and a code in my pocket, and two alien children sleeping like fallen planets at my feet. Their breathing was the soft punctuation to the promises I intended to break and keep. Outside, the city held its own breath, unaware of the geometry of a mother's planning. Inside, the house hummed with the small warmth of life and the colder electricity of something about to be set in motion. The push and the pull had yielded a trajectory. Now, the experiment would begin in earnest, and the consequences, political, personal, cosmic, would be measured not in lab notes, but in the quick, fierce ache of a heart that had been given new kinds of questions to answer. The first fracture came not with fists or shouting, but with a small, ordinary betrayal. A photograph that appeared on a morning feed, grainy and crooked, showing my face in profile and the silhouette of my house in the background. The caption implied collusion. Elena Voss, the mother who let diplomacy swap her kids, followed by a cascade of comments that felt like cold rain. For 3 days, the story mutated. She's complicit, she's grieving, she's unstable. The ministry moved quickly to stage damage control. A press secretary read a short, polished statement about confidentiality and national interest. My phone rang until the battery gave up, each call a new demand for either confession or denouncement. Someone on the line suggested I might be offered a program if I agreed to the narrative the state wanted. Someone else whispered threats. The children became unwilling evidence. Reporters knocked at the door. Diplomacy's public relations team rehearsed how to hold our faces up to a camera and make them legible. Lyra, who had learned to mirror human grief with a grotesque perfection, began to withhold things. A sketch she had been making of orbit lines, a hummed tune that finally took on the cadence of the twins' names. She grew quieter in the evenings, as if the light under her skin had been dimmed by rumor. The other child, whose small hands had once handled my hair with brazen faith, started waking gasping, his sleep punctured by nightmares in which metal teeth chewed at the edges of safe places. They were learning what reputation could do to a house. Daniel changed the tenor of his visits. Where he once brought small confidences wrapped in the sterile language of duty, now he arrived with a faster, harder edge. He spoke in instructions more than in asides. "Keep them sheltered," he told me one night, the words blunt as a hammer. "No unsupervised contact, no interviews."
If the ministry asks you to sign something, don't. Call me first. He held my gaze as if testing whether I would obey. In the same motion, he scheduled a meeting with a lawyer who mouthed reassurances that tasted like formaldehyde. Even his concessions carried the weight of contingency. I could read in his gestures that he would give me what he could, only so far as his orders allowed. The woman from the archives, Priya, stopped returning my messages. Calder became hard to find. His scrapyard was cordoned off one afternoon with tapes that read, "Property of the Ministry." The more I tried to unspool the truth, the more the threads reknotted into new, unfriendly patterns. Whoever had placed my children into orbit had also built walls to keep anyone from climbing them. Each attempt to reach across those walls felt like a private sin against the fragile diplomatic fabric, and also like a necessary theft against an immoral architecture. Inside the house, small rebellions multiplied. Lyra began to refuse the acclimation sessions that were supposed to teach her a proper human smile. She stared at the human teachers, men and women hired to instruct her in table manners and outdoor games, and instead answered questions with dense, jewel-like phrases that meant nothing to them. "How is Sky?" she asked once, and the trainer laughed in relief as if she had said a childish thing. But when Lyra said it to me, her voice held a chord I could not ignore. It implied an answer I was not yet ready to translate. The sky was full of places, and some of them held my sons. The house, which had once been a place of ordinary domestic experiments, baking, bedtime, biology lessons, took on the eerie hush of an observation post. Cameras the ministry claimed were for acclimation recorded our days. Drones the size of pigeons skimmed the eaves. I learned to move like a subject under study. Small movements, predictable rituals, a rehearsed smile. The strain of living under observation gnawed at the edges of me, fraying patience into brittle responses I did not intend. I snapped at nurses who offered advice at the wrong time. I cried in toilets with the door locked and found later that someone had written a clinical note about my emotional volatility. Secrets multiplied in the cracks. There were wardens in gray who arrived at odd hours to take temperament readings. There were forms I was not allowed to keep, and a doctor who avoided my eyes and quietly suggested that the stress could cause false memories, that grief rewires the brain and makes the absent present in dangerous ways. The gaslighting was surgical. It left me doubting things I had once known to be true by the simple geography of memory. But fractures are not only made by outside pressure. They are born of the human heart's need to cleave itself in two to survive. The first real break between Daniel and me came with a file he handed me in a hallway that smelled of lemon cleaner and old coffee.
It was a simple list, nothing official. Names and dates. a pattern that traced placements not just during the latest summit, but for years prior. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting I recognized as neither mine nor the ministry's, was a single sentence. They thought the world would accept exchange. They underestimated mothers. He looked like a man who had been emptied of some necessary thing. "I can help you," he said, "but you have to be willing to cross a line I can't. If you take this path, there are no guarantees about what will come after." "What line?" I asked, though I already knew. Hacking manifests, falsifying entries, abducting the children from a station hung in the sky. The line would be civil, legal, moral. It would be a kind of theft that mirrored the theft which had been done to me. He answered with a confession. "I have obligations to protect the peace, to safeguard the tenuous truce we've built. But I also have a memory of a different life, one where I kept a boy from picking a fight on a playground, and he grew into a man who never learned to be afraid of being touched. I keep thinking of that when I look at you, and his voice broke. "I think we can do it, but I don't know if we can live with the aftermath." The thing about love in a time of conspiracy is that it can be the catalyst for both tenderness and ruin. Daniel and I stood in that corridor, an axis of duty and feeling, and for a thin, blazing instant, the world narrowed to the soft weight of hands clasped between us. The corporate lights hummed, indifferent, as if to say the cosmos had pre-approved anything but human feeling. We tried to make a plan, stumbling over the categories of treason and motherhood. We mapped Calder's manifest windows onto Priya's photocopies, overlaying Daniel's access code like a compass. We measured the risk, the surveillance patterns, the times when the ring's logistics reported the least traffic. Every variable had contingencies within contingencies. Our tentative strategy read like a field manual for a crime I had never intended to commit, until the moment it became the only form of rescue I could conceive. The children were vulnerable to the fractures that opened between us. Lyra watched us with the patient intelligence of an animal sensing a storm, and when the arguments in the kitchen reached a pitch that made her cover her ears, she retreated under the bed and hummed to herself, until the motes under her skin pulsed slow and steady, an attempt to regulate the house's tremors. The other child began to repeat the twins' names like a talisman, saying them in the night until I would lean over and press my forehead to his and beg him to stop, unable to hear the names anymore with a new, jagged ache. Then the most intimate fracture of all happened, a whistle at the property line, a low and purposeful drone that circled with a sound like an animal scenting blood. The ministry had tightened its surveillance.
Someone had decided my curiosity was a threat. Priya was discovered, her file access revoked, and her life made public as someone who had betrayed the ministry's trust. Calder's scrapyard was emptied overnight. Daniel returned one evening with a new expression, a man reconciled to limits. "They've cracked down," he said. "They're not going to allow another unsanctioned narrative." "I thought you could get us a single window," I said, the plea worn thin and ragged as a bandage. "One moment to take them, and then we can run, Daniel. We can disappear with the sons I never stopped hearing in my bones." He took off his jacket and sat at the kitchen table like a man waiting for a verdict. "I can get you the route, and I can probably get you transit codes during a shift change," he admitted, "but there will be consequences. They may cut our access to each other. They may indict you. They may call you a saboteur. They may label any action you take as provocation." He stared at the paper in his hands as if it held the map of damnation. "I can't promise your boys will come home. I can promise you a path that will make us complicit in something we will both carry." For a moment, I thought of my son's small fingers, of the way they had fit into my palms like a science problem solved by the precision of touch. I thought of the other children, of Lyra's constellations and the brittle trust in her eyes. All at once, the world felt like a balance scale with human lives on both pans and a state machine that could tither with a bureaucratic flick. I made the choice I had been rehearsing in my silent notebook, to act. Not for glory, not for politics, but because the geometry of a mother's love compresses into a single demand when it has been shocked. To leave the children in my care without trying would be to accept a life amputated by someone else's idea of peace.
To act might break that peace, and if it did, then I would hold my fractures like proof that the human heart could not be negotiated away. The next morning, while the sky still held the memory of night, Daniel slid an envelope beneath my door. Inside was a single sheet, a 2-hour window of transport, a code, and a route that threaded through the ministry's blind spots. At the bottom, in his precise hand, were 3 words: "For the children." Outside, the city breathed like someone about to begin mourning or rejoicing. Inside, the house carried the weight of a plan I could not yet see to its end. The fractures had become the only pathway through which light could penetrate, and the pieces we would lose to find the pieces we loved most were already being counted in the hollow of my chest. We moved like thieves of light. The window Daniel had slid under my door became a heartbeat in the house. 2 hours carved out of the world when a cargo shuttle would swing low for maintenance, and the manifests would be shuffled while sleepy technicians logged coffee breaks.
Calder's logistics, Priya's photocopies, Daniel's access code wound together into a single thin rope. We rehearsed in silence, tracing steps with fingers on the kitchen table, speaking only when the plan needed the friction of sound. The children asked questions with the bluntness of beings who did not always separate need from demand. Lyra wanted to know what a ring station tasted like. The other child wanted confirmation that names could live again. I taught them a lullaby that had no words and meant everything, a pattern of breath and touch I hoped would ferry us across bureaucracies. The night we moved, the rain had washed the street clean, and the world smelled like possibility and metal. Daniel's face was a map of decisions. The softness that had lived behind his eyes in stolen moments hardened into a readiness I had not thought him capable of. He kissed my forehead like a benediction, his lips lingering in the hollow of my grief. "If we do this," he said, voice low with an intimacy that made my resolve quake and my heart swell, "we do it together. Whatever comes after, you will not be alone." I wanted to say everything: thank you, I love you, forgive me, but the words tangled into one another and became useless luggage. Instead, I pressed my palm to his chest and felt the steady engine of him. That is the kind of confession that can salvage or ruin, not a promise made on paper, but a vow pressed skin to skin. We wore the wardrobe of invisibility, plain coats, faces washed clean of expression. The ministry's cameras were a chorus of indifferent eyes. The drones had softer pupils that watched for deviation. Daniel moved with the practiced economy of a man who could charm a server into misfiling a crate. He nodded to technicians like an old colleague, his badge a borrowed god that opened doors. Calder's route threaded us past maintenance bays and past the elevators that hummed with the transit of things that were never questioned. At the transfer hub, the rank station hung above the city like an accusation. It gleamed with institutional calm, the kind that believes bureaucracy absolves cruelty. My stomach turned at the sight of the cargo lift, sterile, clinical, the same machinery that had ferried my sons into its orbit. Daniel slipped a forged manifest into a pocket and handed me the code with fingers that trembled. There was no time for theatrics. We moved. Inside the cargo bay, the air was thin and smelled of ozone. Rows of crates labeled with sterile numbers lined the floor. Technicians moved in patterned boredom. I kept my hands on Lyra's small shoulder, feeling the motes under her skin dim with fright and flare with resolve. The other child clutched my sleeve like a lodestar. For a moment, all my life, the quiet patience of lab nights, the accidental ferocious tenderness of motherhood, converged into the single precise motion of opening a crate.
We found them where Lyra had shown me in her small drawings, a containment cell that smelled faintly of manufactured night. The twins were smaller under the ring's light than in my memory, their hair thinner, their faces waxen with the soft pallor of enforced distance. When they looked up and recognized me, something in the station shifted. Their eyes slid into mine and made my bones combust into a tenderness so sharp I cried without permission. The alarm went off like a clap of finality. Someone must have tripped a sensor. Perhaps it was the little hand that reached for mine and grasped with a force that said, "I remember you." Lights snapped red. Voices became knives. Daniel moved between the technicians and us like a man reshaping rumor into barrier. "This is a civilian retrieval authorized under special humanitarian protocol," he said, his voice carrying through the bay with the practiced cadence of someone used to soft lies. His words bought us a handful of seconds, the kind that stretches and becomes an eternity. Then they cut through to the rest of the ministry. Orders combusted into legal thunder. A personnel lift lowered with the precision of consequence, and figures in uniform came down like meteors.
Daniel's face stayed open and honest in that surreal way that was no longer a mask. He had chosen a side in a system that demanded neutrality, and neutrality answered with steel. In the scramble, a technician shoved at me, accusing sharp. The other child screamed, a sound like a fracture, and the twins clutched my wrists so tightly I felt the pressure of their small lives. Lyra wrapped her arms around the smaller of the twins and hummed the lullaby we had taught each other. The motes on her skin flared into a constellation that painted the bay with something like mercy. It was that human-alien chorus, an alien voice learning tenderness, that made the world indecisive for a dangerous beat. Daniel was arrested in the doorway, not gently. One of the uniformed men pressed a gloved hand over his mouth and snapped cuffs like a verdict. He looked back at me with an expression that gave me everything and nothing. Apology, love, a sacrifice arranged in the time it takes to exhale. "Go," he mouthed. There was despair braided with a pleading that insisted I leave with the children. His sacrifice was clear, the cost of his mercy paid now with the currency of his freedom. I could not leave him. The choice split me like lightning. Every instinct whispered to take the twins and run, to close a future around them that still smelled like home. But to run meant cutting Daniel loose like a lifeboat we could not afford to lose. In that choice lay the true geometry of love, whether to rescue one heart at the expense of another. I made a decision that was less heroic than it was honest. I stepped forward and reached for Daniel's hand as soldiers closed in. The universe contracted into the small rectangle where our fingers braided.
I pressed my forehead to his and let the world pour through. "Forgive me. Save them. Promise me." He answered with a look that said he had already promised, and that his promise was both wound and anchor. "Tell them I authorized this," I said to the first officer who approached, my voice a brittle diplomacy of its own. "Tell them this is my custody request. I will take full responsibility. Release him to me, and we will present ourselves." The words were a gamble fashioned out of exhaustion and a newly feral courage. They hesitated, mouths forming the calculations of consequences. In that hesitation, the twins wriggled free and slid into my arms. We ran, down corridors and through doors that smelled of policy and panic. The evac lift shuddered and took us to the ground level, where the rain waited as if washed by absolution. Daniel was still cuffed, his shoulders slumped as if the world had finally given him the punishment it believed fit for someone who had confused duty with heart. I kept the twins pressed to my chest, their warmth and argument I could not argue with. Lyra trailed, clinging to my coat like an extra heartbeat. Outside, beneath the low dark, crowds had gathered, some hopeful, some furious, all hungry for the shape a mother made when she broke a rule to save her children. I thought of the cost and counted it like scar tissue. Daniel's career, my safety, the peace that had been propped up on other people's sacrifices. I had traded one kind of order for the messy, incandescent honesty of a family reclaimed. An agent shoved a camera into my face, legalities demanded a narrative, and a voice called for records. Daniel's wrists were freed not by the ministry, but by me. I spoke, loudly and plainly, of authority and custody, and of the human fact that no treaty should convert children into bargaining chips. My words were a defiance dressed in the vocabulary of law and love. Whether they would stand in a courtroom or on a treaty table was still a question. Whether they had bought an hour of safety for the children was not. In the shuffle, Daniel leaned into me, brief, burning, and whispered, "Whatever comes, I choose you." His confession was a theft in its own right, a man stealing away the armor he had worn all his life to stand naked in front of the only person who had asked him to be more human. We did not escape unscathed. The ministry opened investigations, broadcasts earned new headlines. Friends in the ministry turned away, and those in the public saw only scandal. But for that one tumultuous night, as sirens wailed and stars hid behind cloud, we were small and incandescent. 4 children and the women and men who loved them, crammed into a car with rain on the windshield and a future unmade. Lyra fell asleep on my lap, the motes on her skin pulsing slow like a tide. The twins slept with their bodies curled around mine as if they were returning to their rightful orbit. The other child clung to Daniel's hand as if it were an anchor.
I looked between them and understood, with a nascent clarity that felt like a prayer, that redemption is not a single act, but the daily choosing to be present in the wake of harm. Daniel had given me his surrender, a sacrifice that would cost him much. In return, I gave him my refusal to let his sacrifice be worthless. We drove into the thin, uncertain dawn. Prosecutors would later call the run an illegal extraction, diplomats would call it reckless, and some would name me traitor. But inside the car, with 4 small breaths and one man's steady presence, love folded us like a map into something new. A family stitched out of rebellion and tenderness, carrying both the weight of what we had lost and the luminous proof that to rescue is to rebel. That night the city learned a lesson the treaties had not. Mothers do not negotiate away their children without first becoming storms. Daniel had become my storm, and he had chosen to break. The consequence would come, with its legal teeth and moral arguments. For now, in the hush between one breath and the next, we were simply together. 4 small lives returned, one saved by a man who had traded his job for the truth he could not bear to hide, and a woman who had learned that sometimes justice begins with the reckless currency of love. The dawn we drove into was the color of bargain hope, thin and insisting. Bye.